In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to thee, O Christ, our God, glory to thee. O Lord, who enlightens every man that cometh into the world, enlighten the eyes of our mind, understanding the gospel teachings, and plant us also fear of thy blessed commandments. Trample down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that will pleasing unto thee. Thou the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and thee who sit up glory, with the Father, Son, and the Holy good and life creating Spirit, will now and ever unto ages of ages. Amen. Ευλογητός η Χριστέ ο Θεός ημών, ο πανσόφους τους αλληλείς αναδείξας, αν τα πέμψας αυτής το πνεύμα το Αγίον, και δι' αυτόν οικουμένης αγινεύσας, φιλάνθρωπε δόξα σοι. Amen. So I can't hear you at all. Am I supposed to hear you, or is it when I'm talking you?
No, it's okay. We're good. We're good.
Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about the Pan-Orthodox Council, because it's obviously a huge issue for the church right now, and a lot of us have heard bits and pieces, but we don't really know the overall picture. We can't make sense of a lot of the things we're being told or we're hearing. There's a lot of let's say sound bites that are flying around the internet without a lot of explanation. Am I right? Does that sound accurate? So I would like to try to put it in context for you tonight, try to talk about what's really important and answer questions. And we've got a number of questions already submitted. You can submit questions toward the end once we're finished with the ones that have already been submitted. And we can get in, get into the essentials, the important aspect of the council, which is the theology and ecclesiology. In other words, what we believe about the church and what we believe about councils, and why it's important, and what are the problems, and what are the potential consequences of the council. So just some general introduction, and then Nico's going to ask some questions that have been submitted already. The council, as you probably know, you've heard, it's been planned for decades, if not, you could actually say a whole century. The first talk of a Pan-Orthodox Council goes back to the very first years of the 20th century. And especially from 1923, when there was a council called, so-called council. It was more like a group of about 15 to 20 representatives of about half of the Orthodox churches, the Pan-Orthodox Congress in Constantinople, called by the Patriarch of Constantinople at that time, Meletios Metexarchis. And this Congress, Pan-Orthodox Congress, they called it, I think, afterwards, it made suggestions for changes in the life of the church. Some of those suggestions actually are still being bounced around by various groups in the Orthodox Church today. One of the things that they're going to be discussing in Crete in just a few days is the question of marriage and its impediments. And dating back to that 1923 council, they were already talking about the question of maybe priests could remarry if they become widows. And of course, that's already been decided by councils in the past, and the decision was that no, they cannot, and they have never been able to remarry after ordination for various pastoral and spiritual reasons. So there were some issues like that issue that were already on the list of issues to be discussed, going back all the way back to 1923. But the council as it is today, and it really began in earnest, the planning really began in earnest in 1963 with Patriarch Athanagoras, when he began the pre-synodical Pan-Orthodox meetings in Rhodes. And then throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were every year or two various meetings, and they had initially had a list of 100 topics that were submitted that potentially could be on the agenda for the council. They narrowed that down to about 12. And now at this council that's going to happen in just a few days, there's only, I think, 6 texts that have been worked out and have been approved by all the Orthodox churches as texts that we should discuss or debate or whatever. I should say that's the question. Has it been approved and accepted by all the Orthodox churches? We're going to talk about that tonight. So we're going back decades, and one of the myths surrounding this council is that these texts have been submitted decades ago and they haven't changed. So we'll talk about that. Have the text changed, and what text are we looking at, and when were they actually really drafted? It's a big issue, and it's really the major issue behind the controversy that's going on around the council right now, because if you follow the events at all, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the Pan-Orthodox Council. And there's a lot of disagreement, and there's actually fear by some that we're going to be facing some kind of schism, if not actual, like a break in communion, then at least a de facto schism in the church. So before I could go into a lot of more detail and give you a lot of background, but I'll just end with this, and then we'll open it up. We'll start with the questions. And that is that what we're looking at is a Pan-Orthodox Council that's been called for Crete. It's next week. But there are a lot of peculiarities about this council that do not make it really a council in the image of the ecumenical councils at all. And I'll just give you a few examples. First of all, they're not inviting all the bishops of the church. So we have a council in which the bishops are not invited in their totality. So for instance, the Church of Greece, 24 bishops will be going, and there are something like 85 bishops in the Church of Greece, I think, or 80 something. In the Church of Russia, there are hundreds of bishops, I think over 400. Only 24 bishops from the Church of Russia will be attending. So they've decided on that, there's basically be representatives, a group of bishops from each church. That's not the way councils have traditionally been done. There hasn't been a limit and a exclusion of bishops in the past. And that's a really important point to understand the dynamics of this council and why immediately there's problems. We'll get into that. Another aspect of this council, another thing that's going on here is that bishops do not have votes, which is unheard of. A bishop does not have a vote on the final topic of the day. So there's six texts that are being considered, and each bishop will not have a vote, but the church will vote as a body. So the Church of Greece, for instance, will get together and they'll say, what do we think about this text? And they'll debate it between themselves, and then they'll come to a conclusion, and they'll say, we as the Church of Greece decide this. However, they might have a very sharp disagreement between themselves. And out of the 24, there might be 13 in favor and 11 against. Is that really an expression of the Church of Greece? It's only 24 bishops, it's not all the 85. And of the 24, half of them are essentially against it. So the image that's going to come out at the end, is it really going to be a Pan-Orthodox decision? No. Besides that, if we're talking about dogmatic issues, it's unheard of in the Orthodox Church for there to be a disagreement on dogmatic issues and not a break in communion. In other words, in the ancient councils, they would call all the bishops to come, and those bishops who supported a position that the council considered heretical, unacceptable dogmatically, they would not be allowed to remain in the council, or they would not be allowed to remain in communion. They would have to accept the decision of the council, or you're excommunicated, or there would be a decisive break. It's impossible to say that we are sharing the same chalice, we're of the same church, but we don't have the same faith. So the supporters of the council have generally said that this council will not consider dogmatic issues, but it's impossible not to consider dogmatic issues when you're talking about issues like the church, the boundaries of the church, where the church is, what the heterodox are. That's a dogmatic issue. And so any text that's going to expound upon that is a dogmatic text. And therefore, there cannot be this kind of disagreement where we're agreeing to disagree and remain in the church, because it's a dogmatic issue. It's an article of faith. We confess, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We don't say, I acknowledge it. That's a translation that circulated in the OCA. That's a very bad translation. We confess one baptism. We confess our faith and believe in the church. We don't acknowledge baptism or acknowledge the church. It's a confession of faith, and we believe in the church because the church is the body of Christ, and the church is Christ himself. He's the head, and it's his body. So it's an article of faith that we have, and it's an article of faith going back 1,700 or more years. It's never been a question for us. We know what the church is. We know where it is, who it is. This is a dogma of the church that's been long ago accepted. So now we're coming and we're questioning that. We're saying, well, no, actually, it's not this. It's something else. And there's all these theories that are circulating today, and people are maintaining them in the Orthodox Church. In that council that's going to happen in a few days, if this text, this very controversial text, it's called The Relations of the Orthodox Church with the Rest of the Christian World, if that is approved, it's a dogmatic text which is considered to be in error by many bishops and even local churches, like the Church of Bulgaria, the Church of Georgia, are not going to the council, as we'll talk about, in large measure because of this text, because they deem it unacceptable. If this council accepts the text, we're going to have serious problems in the church in terms of maintaining Orthodox unity. And of course, bishops within the council who disagree with the text may end up leaving the council, may end up disowning the council, and certainly there will be bishops who did not go and were not invited who will reject the council. So I'm getting ahead of myself, though, and there's so much one could talk about. Let's take question at a time. And you asked me the first question, Nico, and we'll get back to some of the issues in more in depth.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Papa. So the first question is, what has actually happened with the council? We've heard from various sources that certain churches have pulled out, others are not going, and is it true, as you alluded to earlier, that, all of the independent or autocephalous churches, agreed to this council, and why are they pulling out at the last minute?
Well, one of the greatest myths that's circulating on the internet and by official voices is that this has been approved by all 14 autocephalous churches. It's a myth because the council was never approved. It never received pan-Orthodox approval, which would require synodical decisions on the part of the local churches. In other words, each local church decides on such issues in synod. All the hierarchy gets together and says, this is what we're going to do. This is a huge issue, very important. The head of the church calls the synod and they decide on this. This did not happen until before the decision was made in January of this past year. So we hear often people say, we have pan-Orthodox decision. It's a pan-Orthodox decision. This is why we're having the council, and people need to honor their decisions. But in fact, the decisions were made by representatives, by the head of the church, and with a few representatives. And that's why after the January decision for the council by the heads of the churches, the decisions came back to the churches, Church of Greece, Church of Romania, all the various churches, and then they had a council. They called the council, most of the churches. I'm not familiar with every single local Orthodox, what they did. Churches then had a local council of bishops to decide what they thought of the text, or what they thought about going. And some said, yeah, we're going to go. Church of Greece had 2 meetings in March and in May. In March, they said, we want to look at these texts and we want to examine them. They had a committee examine them. They came back in May, and they suggested tremendous changes to the text, a whole list of changes they want made to the text. And then they decided, we're going to go to the council and we're going to support these changes. We want to see these changes made. That's the Church of Greece. Church of Bulgaria had several meetings, and they decided they're not going to go to the council. That's not in the best interest of the Church of Bulgaria. In spite of the decision made by the primate in the meeting in January, he doesn't represent the Church of Bulgaria without synodical backing. This is really important to understand why there are accusations flying against these churches that are not going to the council, and they're really off base, and it's not accurate to say that there was a pan-Orthodox decision in January. Church of Georgia is the same thing. They had several meetings of the hierarchy to decide their position on this text. Those decisions had not been made. Now we need to go back a little bit. We're going to go back a little bit, and we're going to talk about the pre-history there to understand why those decisions were made. They were not made before January, before the primates went and said, yes, we're going to have a council. The key thing here I want to stress again is that there was a process of synodical, in other words, conciliar, synodical, the bishops together. There was a process of them accepting the decision of the primate and the representatives. And that process in some churches was positive, in other churches it was negative. But the question is not why was it so late. People are saying, oh, they're so late. We've been planning this conference, this council for decades. And at the last minute, they're pulling out. Well, I'll explain to you why that's the case. But one of the reasons is that there was no synodical examination until March, May, April, and May. So whose fault is it that they did not have the opportunity to decide on the question of the council? Maybe the organizers of this whole Pan-Orthodox Council should have allotted time for the local synods to get together and decide, and not base their decisions simply on the decisions of representatives. If we're truly interested in conciliarity, synodical decisions, the whole church being a part of the decision, we're going to build into the whole process time for the local churches, the local synods, to meet and discuss the text and discuss the council and approve them. And then we're going to set the date for the council. So the problem is deeper than, well, they bailed out at the last minute. That's not accurate. And it's actually disingenuous on the part of those people who are saying it. Everything in the Orthodox Church happens in council when it's on this level. So that's the answer to the first question, Nico. What's the second question?
Okay, so you sort of alluded to it in the links here. You know, some are saying that, you know, the texts, all of the texts where they were prepared for council, and, you know, everyone knew about them, they were well known. And since they have been, you know, drafting and preparing them for years, even decades, right? Like, is that true, or is it not true?
Yeah, that's part of the problem here, is that we're not paying attention to how these texts came about and when they came about. Now, some of the texts have been prepared and not seen much change at all. But the one text that's very controversial and people are against, the one I was talking about earlier, the relations of the Orthodox Church with the rest of the Christian world, and there's a lot of opposition to this text. This text was essentially drafted in October of last year. In other words, this text is a result of two different texts that were merged together, and then there were additions and changes made to it. So it's a totally new text that the churches had not read or seen. And that happened in October. Here's the amazing part about this story. That text was not made public until January, until the primates had signed the text and had signed that they were going to go to the council. Then the text became public, and then all this opposition came and said these are not Orthodox texts, or at least this text is not Orthodox. This is one dealing with the heterodox. So essentially, we're dealing with a text that became public only a few months ago. And the synods of the churches are saying, wait a minute, this text is not Orthodox. The idea that these have been planned for decades, and it's not true in terms of this particular text, which is the real controversial one. So, and these texts, the amazing part about it is these texts wouldn't have even been made public if certain churches hadn't insisted on them being made public at the January meeting. And so we have the central problem here is that some people are not respecting nature of the church. They're not wanting, for whatever reason, the faithful, the theologians, the monks, the bishops, the rest of the bishops who are not a part of this process, because there's very few people a part of this process. It's a small group of representatives who've been making all these decisions over the years with sometimes with synodical approval, sometimes without. And so for some reason, some people don't want these to become known to the faithful, for them to think, write, react to them, and for this discussion to happen. They want to have the council and the text to be approved and without a lot of discussion. And so what happened was there immediately arose a great opposition because the text was not made public and people didn't know about it. And some of the churches decided that on this basis, we're not going to the council because we don't agree with this text. And, well, we can talk about the rest of the answer further on. Why don't you ask the next question and we'll get back to that.
Okay. So again, these are all linked together, but why were some churches, quote unquote, so late in expressing their opposition to these texts?
Well, yeah, we just talked about that a little bit. Let me add some more to that. As I said earlier, we hear a lot about pan-Orthodox decisions and that everything's been approved on a pan-Orthodox level. But the signatures of the heads of their church, as I said, are not pan-Orthodox decisions. And this goes to the heart of a way of looking at the church today, which is very problematic. Can the heads of the church make a decision without synodical backing? Can, even if the head of a church signs something, if he didn't do it in the name of the synod with approval of the synod, it's worthless. It doesn't mean anything for us. We don't have popes in the Orthodox Church. No local archbishop or bishop or patriarch is a pope. He can't do anything without the consent of the synod. In fact, there's a canon that is very well known to all these bishops that says the head of the church should always operate in connection and in agreement with the rest of the bishops and the rest of the bishops with the head of the church. So there's this between the two. They cannot operate independently, but essentially that's what was going on with the preparation for the Holy Council. The primates were operating more or less independently, and when the wind of it in some of these churches, they reacted and they said. So they're not at fault for reacting this late in the game, this late in the history of the question, and reacting in such a way as to disagree or disapprove of the text and of the council itself.
Okay. So the question now being posed is, so are you saying that there is no pan-Orthodox support for the council without decisions by these different holy synods?
Yeah, this is really important to understand. Pan-Orthodox support for the council exists only in terms of the representatives of the churches signing on the documents, but that's not an Orthodox way of operating. So no, there isn't pan-Orthodox support for the council as long as there's not, as long as it's not gone through the process of the holy synods of the local churches supporting it. And it's very characteristic that in the Church of Bulgaria, the example of the Church of Bulgaria, there was true unanimity of all the bishops not to go to the council and not participate because of the way it had gone about, because it was very difficult to make, as I'll talk about now, it's very difficult to make any changes in the council texts, and that the texts themselves are totally unacceptable. So, but that was made as a synodical decision of all the bishops of Bulgaria. And isn't that what we want? We want a synodical system. We want a conciliar system. We want everybody to be involved. We want all the bishops to partake in the decisions of the church. I thought that was what Orthodox was all about. So if that doesn't exist on every local church, then why, on what basis can we talk about a pan-Orthodox decision? But also just to note this, because people don't know this, the churches of Georgia and Antioch actually never agreed to all of the texts. They have two texts that they disagreed with, and that was the case in January. That was the case in October. They did not accept one of the texts dealing with the mission of the Orthodox Church. They did not accept it because it says in there that it basically changes the decision of an ecumenical council in terms of Christian marriage. And they said this is unacceptable because the decision has been made in the ecumenical council. The point is that two local churches actually, even in January, when they say we have a pan-Orthodox decision, they didn't agree. They didn't sign on the dotted line. Church of Antioch for 3 years has been saying that we have to have reconciliation with the Church of Jerusalem. They have a dispute, and before we can go to the council in Crete. That was ignored. That was ignored. So there are at least 2 local churches that never agreed with one of the texts and with the calling of the council without certain things happening before the council came to pass. So no, we do not have a pan-Orthodox consensus and agreement. If you look at the details, if you go beyond just the headlines, and you look at the details, and you know the history of the question the last 6 months, there was never true 100% pan-Orthodox agreement for this council in Crete.
Okay, so next question is it true that the churches which refuse to agree to the final text at the council will still have to sign the text for sake of Orthodox unity?
Well, it remains to be seen what will happen in practice, but the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, has said in his speech in January before all the hierarchs, the representatives, that if a minority of 1 or more churches votes against the text, this in no way negates the unanimity of the decisions. Now, this seems very contradictory, because unanimity means homophonia, which means one voice. So when we're talking about homophonia, we mean that everybody agrees. It's very simple. But he's giving a different interpretation, probably based on contemporary ecumenical norms, and he's giving a different interpretation. He's saying that, in fact, a church can disagree, will note the disagreement, but they'll still have to sign the documents. And that's truly amazing. If what he's saying is put into practice in Crete, you could see a church like the Church of Greece, which wants major changes to the text, essentially being told that, okay, we understand your disagreement, but you're still going to sign the text for the sake of Orthodox unity. And of course, when the Church of Bulgaria saw something like that, they said, why go? We're not going to agree with the text because the texts have to be changed unanimously. Why go? And so if you start to understand the dynamics, what's really happening on the ground, what this council, how it's being organized, how it's not a council in the tradition of the church, how each bishop does not have a vote, how each church is going to vote in a block, how it has to be, all these changes have to be made unanimously, so very unlikely that changes that people want to be made, these texts are going to be made. You could begin to see very much why a church like Bulgaria or Georgia would not want to go to the council. They're smelling something that's not, from the beginning, from the foundation, there's something wrong with this whole process.
So it's like saying, I'm going to buy the house and I'll sign the documents, but my price is going to change. But no, you're going to sign the documents buying the house at the price that I'm telling you at. But I'll note that you want a different price. Okay. Next question. Can the text be changed at the council? Aren't the bishops attending expected to contribute to the revision of the documents?
The text cannot be changed unless every change is unanimously approved. I was just talking about that, but let's explain that. Unless every change is unanimously approved. So this is rather impossible. In an 8-day time period, each bishop will have 10 minutes to speak. And in that 8-day time period, they're going to have to approve 6 texts, and at least 2 of the texts have major disagreements between the bishops. It's very unlikely they're going to come to a consensus, and it would mean that some churches would have to do a total about-face, like the Church of Constantinople, or maybe the Church of Alexandria, or other churches. They would have to take a whole different approach and change their positions in order for a text to be approved. And that's, again, why churches like Bulgaria say, if I go there, the changes I want to see made are not going to be made. It's 99%. It's almost impossible for these changes to be made. And there's talk that I'm going to have to sign the documents anyway, because documents are going to come out. There'll be a minority against it. We're probably going to be in the minority, they're thinking. And so, therefore, I'm going to be forced to sign the documents anyway. Yeah, theoretically, changes can be made if they're made unanimously, but that in practice, that's not going to happen. Go ahead.
So it's that reminds me of the Greek song "Δεν τη θέλω, θα την πάρεις." Okay. Are the decisions of the council binding on the whole church?
No, the decisions of the council are not binding on the whole church. The decisions cannot be considered binding for several reasons. First of all, not all Orthodox churches will be present. So decisions taken in their absence certainly cannot be considered binding on them unless their own holy synods adopt the decisions of the council. Unless the holy synods adopt the decisions made in their absence, which is unlikely, they're not binding on the churches that are not attending. Secondly, even if all Orthodox churches were present in the council, the decisions would not be binding unless and until the holy synods, the hierarchy of each local church, met and adopted them. And thirdly, since the council is not inviting all Orthodox bishops, but only 24 from each local church, the decisions of the council cannot be considered binding unless all of those bishops, a majority of the Orthodox bishops, are not attending. So all of the rest of the hierarchy, about 3/4 of the hierarchy, who are not invited, accept the decisions. If they don't accept the decisions, it's not binding. And in fact, the most amazing part of this question, the answer to this question, is from Metropolitan John Zizoulos of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, who said that if the council does not invite a bishop, that bishop is not bound by the decisions and is free and rightly can reject them. So we have a very confused message coming out of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, because we're hearing on one hand, decisions are binding, even if you don't go. On the other hand, we're hearing from another bishop of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Metropolitan John Zizoulos, that if a bishop's not invited, it's not incumbent upon him to accept the decisions. He's not required because he wasn't invited. That's very sound, logical, Orthodox ecclesiology. So no, the decisions are not binding.
Okay, and then the final question, then we'll open it up further, is, and this is really interesting, more like church politics. Isn't this just a power play between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate?
No, and that's an unfortunate development in the last few days, that people are trying to make it into a political power play on the part of the Moscow Patriarchate or the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The objections to the council's organization and text are totally unrelated to such issues, as is apparent in the decisions of the churches of Bulgaria and Georgia. It's very unfortunate that Orthodox Christians cannot stay focused on the essential theological and dogmatic issues at hand, which lie behind the decisions of the churches of Greece, Bulgaria, and Georgia. And they become influenced by worldly and political currents to define the problem as a power struggle. It's not a power struggle. Respect for the venerable churches of Georgia and Bulgaria and Greece demand that we seriously take into consideration what they're saying in terms of the text, the problems with the text, its importance, of the utmost importance to Orthodox unity and the Orthodox mission. The enemy of our salvation wants nothing more than to disorient us, disorient the faithful, and create a schism over secondary matters. So we must stay focused on the way and the truth of Christ, and then we will have the ability to discern each decision and each development within the Orthodox fullness, and we'll see it for what it is, and our reaction will be upbuilding for the church. So we should ignore those who want to turn this into a political debate between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This is the spirit of Pythona, Pneuma Pythonos, the spirit of Python at work, which is half-truths and not of God. This idea that this is a political power struggle. It's clearly not. It goes much deeper, and I think I made that point. I hope I've made that point successfully tonight. Showed you that the serious ecclesiological problems with the council going back at least 6 months, if not further. So let's open up to other questions. And I think somebody has a question over on the right.
Is it on? Can you hear me, Father?
Yeah.
Kyrios.
Kyrios.
My question is, so you said that out of the 80, specifically the Church of Greece, out of the 80 or so bishops, 24 are going. Now, did they send invitations to all and only 24 accepted, or did they only send invitations to these 24? And if so, why these particular ones? Were they handpicked? Or, to be blunt, I guess, were they more, seemed to be more in favor of the texts? How
Well,
they
the
decide?
church, in the case of the Church of Greece, each church is different in terms of who's going. But no, they were not invited. Only 24 were invited from each church, and the church itself decided who those 24 would be. So in the terms, they had a meeting of the Holy Synod, and they decided on certain criteria. Basically, they said what bishops are involved now at this particular time in the diarchis, the permanent Holy Synod, which is, I believe, 12 bishops, or maybe 14. Those 12 or 14 bishops would go, and then they said, well, who else would go? Bishops from the previous Holy Permanent Synod or other capacities who are serving in other capacities. So they created some kind of criteria, and they agreed on that criteria, and then they said those bishops would go. And so some bishops are there are different opinions between those bishops. So there's not, at least in the Church of Greece, there's not an attempt to stack the decks, let's say, in one way or another. But each local church had to decide on what basis and who would go. The problem is not so much that who's being decided, who's being chosen to go. Problem is that the rest of the bishops who aren't going and who have no say and who have no vote, they should not be. They should have. There's no necessity for them to accept the council. They should be present. The church has always seen each bishop as co-responsible for the church. This whole process of taking it away from the pleroma, the fullness of the bishops, and restricting it to just a few bishops, and even really restricting it mainly to the primates. I mean, this council, as Metropolitan Heroes Rockels has said, this council is really a council of primates, in other words, heads of the churches, and not a council of bishops. Because at the end of the day, the primate in every local church has a lot of power, a lot of sway over the other people, and he's going to determine in large measure what a local church is going to do. So that's the real problem, is that we've gotten away from Orthodox ecclesiology, and we're talking about pan-Orthodox decisions, but really we mean decisions of representatives of the churches and not all the bishops. And it's the same thing with the council. The council is not going to be a pan-Orthodox decision. Whatever they say, whatever they come out with, whatever they teach, it's not pan-Orthodox, because not all the bishops are there. In fact, the majority are not there. And then not all the bishops don't even have a vote. The churches have a vote in the person of the primate. So there's a systematic problem here. We have a diversion from Orthodox ecclesiology from the foundations, not just the texts that are coming out from the council.
So Father Peter, who actually established this? I'm a little bit confused. I mean, on the one side, if they're calling it pan-Orthodox, who put out the rationale saying, okay, each church will decide however they want to come? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Either it's pan-Orthodox or it's not. I'm confused.
Well, they said that each church can bring up to 24 bishops. They don't have 24 bishops, so they're not, they're going to bring how many they have. But they're saying that no more than 24 can come from each church. That was a decision of the primates, not of the local synods.
So the primates, when they met, the primates decided only 24. Yeah,
it was all done in a negotiational, table of primates and representatives. And 2 years ago, I think it was, in the beginning of Lent, and then this past January. And then some churches reacted against it and said, we don't agree for a variety of reasons, and we're not going. Other churches said, we're going, but we want changes. Other churches said, no problem, we're fine with it. But that's not how you achieve pan-Orthodox unity. You don't achieve pan-Orthodox unity in this way. You create schisms in this way.
And why do you think it was done that way?
I can only speculate, and there's a lot of people doing that today. The problem is not what I think. I'm far away from the inner workings. The problem is that whatever the reasoning was, whatever the motivation was, the outcome is not Orthodox. And so we're going to have problems. And the day after is, who knows the day after, but it certainly has the potential to be very explosive and be very problematic for the church because it wasn't based on Orthodox principles. Another question?
If some of these texts are approved, how does that affect the layperson in at the church level? And if at a local level we don't agree with what has been discussed and agreed upon, quote unquote, is it our duty to do obedience and listen and do what they have agreed upon, or can we? I don't know. Is there a response that's allowable?
Well, if this council or any council teaches something that's not in agreement with the tradition of the church and the dogma of the church, if, for instance, if this council comes out with a teaching that the Church of Christ is not just the Orthodox Church, but it's also the Roman Catholic, or that Roman Catholics and Protestants participate in the Church of Christ and they have the mysteries of the church. These kind of teachings are unorthodox. They're not patristic ecclesiology. They're not the teaching of the church. And if this council taught such things, then you would not only have the ability and the right to reject it, it would be incumbent upon you as an Orthodox Christian to reject the council. And that's exactly the stance that's being taken by those who are trying to follow the Holy Fathers. They understand that a council in and of itself does not guarantee orthodoxy. There have been false councils, many. And we can just name a few. The most well-known would be the Robber Council of 14, which is in Ephesus, and that was the counter-council to the Council of Chalcedon. And they anathematized the Orthodox there. So there are plenty of examples. Council of Lyon, the Council of Florence, they were false councils. They were councils of bishops who went and represented the church and did not teach orthodoxy. In that case, we all need to reject the council, follow the Orthodox bishops, whoever they are, wherever they are, and struggle against the acceptance of the council's decisions. If the council does not have any dogmatic decisions, if they have decisions that are of a disciplinary matter, that are still unorthodox, we can struggle against it without it being considered a heretical teaching. And then that's going to be a different kind of struggle and a different kind of resistance. It's going to be through the bishops and not, hopefully there will be no split, and it's more nuanced. But if it's a clear dogmatic diversion and there's a number of churches or bishops that are actively supporting this dogmatic diversion, then yes, things become very dire and we need to resist and follow the Orthodox bishops and clergy that are teaching aright the faith.
Father, can you give an example of the second part, like where it's quote unquote not really dogmatic, but there's nuance and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, if the church comes out, if this council comes out and teaches that marriages with non-Orthodox are not just by extreme economy, but essentially they make it almost a crivia, which is where they're going and why the Church of Georgia objects to the reference in one of the documents. That would be a diversion from an ecumenical council. It would be an innovation. It would be not clearly a dogmatic diversion. It's not an article of faith. We don't believe in. It's not the same as believing in Christ or believing in the Holy Trinity or believing in the Church, but it would be definitely an innovation and a diversion from the tradition and the decisions of the ecumenical councils. And the local churches, people, faithful bishops, clergy should resist that and work against that and not follow that teaching. That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have the same kind of consequences you'd have for a major dogmatic diversion. So I think each circumstance and each innovation and each diversion really needs discernment on the part of the priest, the bishop, the faithful. We don't need reactions and schisms. Those who divert from the faith and who teach otherwise are the ones who should be removed from the church or can depart from the church. We who are trying to struggle to keep the teachings of the fathers are not going to go anywhere. So we need to be patient, discerning, but strong and mindful when we're encountering these kind of innovations and diversions from the church.
Father Peter, just because it cut out at the very beginning, could you just give the example again?
The example was that it's very possible might happen is that the documents on the mission of the Orthodox Church in the modern world, there's a reference, if I'm not mistaken, there's a reference to the being blessed to have intermarriages. In other words, Orthodox, can you hear me?
Yes. So Orthodox
marry non-Orthodox. Now that is, there's an ecumenical council and a canon of the ecumenical council which forbids this. This is not blessed. This happens all the time, but it's supposedly by extreme economy and not because there's any normality to it. In other words, it's an extreme pastoral economy for particular instances. But if you're going to pass something like this and have an ecumenical or a pan-Orthodox council approve it, it takes on the status of a krivia. In other words, it's like a normal occurrence and not an extreme economy. And actually, there's a real danger that they're going to, the reasoning behind this is, well, because they are baptized Christians. In other words, why can an Orthodox Christian marry a Protestant or Catholic and not a Muslim? Well, because they're baptized Christians. Well, that exactly is the baptismal theology, cacodoxy of ecumenism, which views the various heterodox confessions as having mysteries. So you immediately see that it's dogmatic diversion because of the reasoning, and it becomes very complicated. And so that's an example that could very, very well happen, because most of the opposition right now is against the other text, which is the relations of the Orthodox Church with the rest of the Christian world, which has many, many problems. The mission of the Orthodox Church in the modern world has this particular reference, and there isn't nearly as much opposition to that. So you could see that as a potential problem emerging from the council. Of course, as I said before, it's not a pan-Orthodox council for 3 or 4 different reasons that I cited. So the decisions should not be considered binding, and therefore I don't expect we're going to have the same kind of problem we have if it was a decision that should, of all the Orthodox churches.
Hopefully, the Father, forgive me if you have already addressed this question. So if this goes through, would there be a schism among the Orthodox? And if so, if not, or if so, is there going to be a new church? How are we going to know as lay people where to go?
Well, it's the day after is still unknown. So we don't know what will happen. We don't know what the decisions will be finally. We don't know how bishops will react who are going to go to the council. There are Orthodox bishops, very good confessing Orthodox bishops, who will attend the council, and they're going to express their Orthodox faith and fight against the innovations. But in the worst case scenario, if they accept this particular text, the relations of the Orthodox Church with the rest of the Christian world, there will most likely, it's all just speculation at this point. So I really can't answer you this definitively, but you could imagine there being a split between those bishops who accept it and those bishops who reject it. Whether it'll take on a split in the sense of non-Eucharistic communion, so we have a schism, an open schism, I don't know. It's hard to say. But in any case, it will definitely be a split between those who agree with it and those who reject it. My feeling is that because it's not going to be binding, even though they tell you it is going to be binding, there's no way this is going to be binding on the church for a variety of reasons, as I said, that it's not going to, we're not going to come to the point where there's an open schism. They're just going to ignore the decisions in certain churches. The problem is, what will your parish do and what your bishop will do? Only God knows at this point, and each person will have to be mindful of what they're teaching, what the bishops are teaching, and what they're saying, and act accordingly, and follow the Orthodox priests or clergy who are not following the new. So it's going to be a St. Basil talks about in the 4th century that he was fighting a naval battle at war. A naval battle at night. So what does that mean? It means that he's got enemies that are maybe friends, and he doesn't know who's who. And that's maybe what we're looking at in the near future. It's going to be very confusing for a time. So you can't really answer that question at this point.
Thank you. Then is, if we're confused, how do we know we're following the path for salvation?
Well, you know the teaching of the church. Understand the teaching of the church. There's plenty of texts that are out there on the internet now that we've translated, we've posted, that are talking about what the church teaches on these issues. So if you know that, if you know the basics at least, and you know the clergy who are mindful of that, when the time comes, it won't be a mystery. It'll be clear. People will come forward and say, this is what's good about this is what's Orthodox, this is what's not. So just be mindful, prayerful, and close to the spiritual fathers and Orthodox who are already confessing the faith. And whatever happens, there'll be clarity in that sense. But there might be a lot of confusion between local churches or bishops. It remains to be seen.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hello? Hi. I'm just curious, is there any politicians involved in this?
I'm not sure what you mean.
A member of CDC, I don't know, like Puria PTS or something? Are they going to the meetings?
As far as I know, there's only bishops involved in the meetings. I don't think there are any politicians. Of course, there are always in these events, there's always political machinations behind the scenes. And politicians are trying to influence it for one way or another for a variety of reasons, their own reasons. But directly, they don't appear to be involved.
Okay, thank you. Evloida, padre. How's it going?
Okay.
Okay, my question is, I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible.
Can you stand so I can see you?
Okay, there's those who oppose all the things that you said, that there's a lot of people out there, lay people, hierarchs, monks, priests, so on and so forth, obviously for valid reasons, who are opposing what's going on. And they're either publicly protesting about it, or they're silently just being disobedient and remaining faithful to the traditions. Those who are in agreement with what's going on, they're going out and they're openly calling them fanatics, fundamentalists, ultra extremist, and so on and so forth. And I'm bringing this up because the word fundamentalist and fanatic, it's being loosely used now. It's being used in a derogatory way by certain syncretistic ecumenists. And my question is, what exactly is a fanatic and a fundamentalist and an extremist? And when one who's being true to the traditions is accused of this, or this label put on them, how do they deal with that? Like, what do they do?
Well, on one level, the Lord said that those who will be persecuted for righteousness' sake are blessed, and those who receive the badge of being outcasts and rejected by society are following in the footsteps of our Lord. So on the one hand, I would say those names that they're calling the Orthodox are a badge of courage, a badge of honor, I should say. And there's nothing really to worry about at all. And actually, you should rejoice. essentially, it is a sign of that there is no argument. On the other hand, when people use ad hominem against the man, ad hominem, and they sink to the level of calling people names and trying to shove them to the side and outside the church, well, this is a sign of weakness on their part and not strength. And it's not something that we need to worry about in the sense of it actually probably should be a sign that our positions are sound and orthodox. But I do agree that there's very little connection going on and even engagement on the part of those who are supporting syncretistic ecumenism. They don't engage the arguments, the texts of the Orthodox. Very, very rarely do you see any engagement. They basically just ignore it. And if they do speak to it, it's with these name calling, and they're usually going against the people and not against the issue itself. So, but to answer your question more directly, a fundamentalist, a fanatic, well, those are words that the meaning here is to say that the people who that they're name calling are undiscerning, ignorant, and fallen into almost like a heresy. There's somehow we're abusing the faith and not presenting the Catholicity of the Church, the teaching of the Church in a Catholic manner, in a full, whole manner, and we're abusing and misrepresenting and misunderstanding the patristic teaching. That's what they're trying to get at with these names that they're calling us, or they're calling at least those who are confessing the faith, teaching the faith. Is that the truth? Is that accurate? I was amazed that they sank to the level, some of them sank to the level of calling Metropolitan Herodes Vlachos a fundamentalist and an extremist and a fanatic. I mean, that's so absurd on the face of it. He's one of the most respected theologians in the Orthodox world today. He's written 60 books. He's gotten awards from universities. I mean, if you're going to call somebody like that a fundamentalist, then really you've sunk to a new low, and it's almost comical. It's tragic. It's tragic. And that's where they're at, some of these extreme fundamentalist, ecumenist types. And so I don't really pay much attention. I try to stay on focus, on target, and stay focused on the theology and the ecclesiology of the church, and just keep bringing it back to the teaching of the church. And anybody who has a good disposition and is mindful of the patristic teachings, they're going to see through that right away. It's not really a serious opposition, so I don't really worry about it.
Father Peter, are you familiar with Father Epifanios Theodoropoulos' book, The Two Extremes?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So would you say, you mentioned earlier about translations, hopefully somebody would sponsor a translation of that book, because I remember I read it years ago and I found it very healthy reading that book. As you know, half of it is answering the ecumenists on the one side, and then the other opposite side, it's answering the hyper zealots, I will call them, or the true fanatics, right? I found that book when I read it very, very healthy to keep you in the middle path. I'm just surprised that today, those kind of books, first of all, aren't being translated, but not only that, they're not being referenced by anybody, because that's a very simple book. At least I found it very simple.
Father Epifanios' famous quote, I think it was Father Epifanios, maybe I'm mistaking him with Father of the Dionysiou, Theokritos, but I think it was Father Epifanios. He said it would be better for the fanar, the patriarchate, to fall into the sea, the Bosphorus, than for them to sell the faith or sell out on the question of the ecclesiology with the Pope. He was talking to Athenagoras at the time. This kind of comment, I'm pretty sure today that they would consider him a fundamentalist. And yet he is probably spiritually, he was probably a spiritual father the more bishops than anybody in the Church of Greece today. There's so many bishops today who had him and went to him and consulted him. And so he was a huge figure for a lot of these contemporary bishops.
Yeah, because I find that book
he was considered in his day very much in the center, and yet today I'm pretty sure that they would consider him to the right. And so that's how things are getting skewed and distorted in our day, and we're getting away from our fathers and our spiritual fathers' examples.
Yeah, if I can bring up one example from that book that I find very healthy, I found the whole book very, very healthy, and he addresses the topic of married bishops. And if I'm not mistaken, he actually says, well, it could happen. He goes, no, there's no else first. If we don't have any monasteries, we don't have any monks, and we don't have this, and this, then yes, it could happen, right? So he brings out these issues that I think that you mentioned earlier that are not necessarily dogmatic, but could cause rift in the harmony of the church. And so I'm just surprised that no one to this point has said, well, look at Father Bifarius said here. Look at this, a beautiful answer. You know, he's not extreme on any of these points here. He's bringing something very, very healthy. I'm just surprised that no one to this point, to my knowledge, is bringing out his book as an example.
It's well known in Greece. I don't know why it's not been translated, and it needs to be more referenced. It's a little dated. I mean, the truth is, it's a little dated. There are aspects of it that are not applicable today, but the main principles that he's presented certainly are applicable. So it would be good to have that translated.
Blessings, Father. I have a last question. It's basically based off a question that somebody else asked earlier, and it's about the lay people. And you were mentioning that this synod, it's not dealing with so much disciplinary matters. It's dealing a lot with dogmatic issues, with certain aspects of it. So I think in the history of the church, during the past, in the ecumenical synods and local synods and whatnot, there was a lot of people that spoke out during the synods that weren't bishops. You know, St. Athanasius the Great, he was a deacon at the time. I think in the second or third ecumenical synod, there was a lay person that spoke out. St. Maximus Confessor was just a simple monk. Patriarch Photios, I think at one time was a lay person and then took the place of a patriarchate or something like that. So I'm just curious as to why the lay people are not allowed to speak. It's almost like they're being cut out of the whole process. They're saying, you don't even have the right to say anything. It's just the bishops that will decide. And is that even canonical? And what do we do?
And on one level, it's not surprising. In other words, lay people, for the most part, would not be direct in ecumenical council. However, ecumenical councils did invite monks. They did invite non-bishops. It's certainly traditional to do that. They didn't. At this council, there's no official voting, member who's not a bishop. Well, actually, as I said, the bishops aren't even voting, but I mean, they're coming just as counselors, essentially, some non-clerics. But at a deeper level, I think the bigger point that you're making, and the more important point, is that the people of God, the monks, the lay people, and the clergy as well, have been out of the loop entirely in this whole process. Not so much that they have to be in Crete. That's not the point, but they were so ignored in the drafting of the documents and in the whole general discussion. And so they're reacting very late and very piecemeal because they've just been out of the whole process. And so that's the deeper crisis, is that it's supposedly a pan-Orthodox council, which I said it's not, but let's just, for argument's sake, let's say that it was a pan-Orthodox council. But it's a council that's ignored the vast majority of the church, and that is the lay people and the monks and the parish priests. Most of them are out of the loop. They don't understand. They haven't followed. They don't understand what's at stake. Many clergy have not followed and do not understand what's at stake. So that's tragic, and that's one of the reasons why the potential for schism is great because the base is not informed, and so they're going to be following more like blind sheep because they're not going to be able to make much sense of a lot of this stuff because they have not been a part of the process. And that's unorthodox. It's an unorthodox approach to a council.
Father Peter, just back to Vicky's point, but we as lay people, what should we do? Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the historical precedent at the false council of Florence, the people that went back, the bishops that went back, and the people said, "You did what? You signed what? You said what?" Right? And they called them on it, and then the ones that repented, cut off our hands that signed a false union and cut off our tongues that gave a wrong profession of faith. So would you say that we as lay people do have the ability, with love and humility, of course, not freaking out, but just basically saying, "Oh, sorry, this is not orthodox. We're not accepting this."
Yeah, I think I said that. Maybe I didn't say clearly. You definitely, as lay people, as clergy, as monks, we do not and cannot accept unorthodox decisions. So we'll react to them in various ways depending on our circumstance and our place. But definitely, the basic is we don't accept them. We will not accept them. They're not, and we'll reject the decisions if they're unorthodox and and especially dogmatically unorthodox. We'll reject them, and that might take the form of voting with our feet and going to another bishop. Because in America, you have a variety of jurisdictions. You can leave one and go to another, but it might also mean going to the bishop, writing a letter, writing a petition. A variety of ways you can express your disagreement and your rejection of the council's decisions if unorthodox.
And back to Simon's point, which I find very interesting about who was invited, and forgive me, I'll be a little bit Spartan for a second. I call them hyper hypocrites, all these lovey-dovey ecumenists, because they invite whoever they want to invite. And at the same time, they invite, from what I've understood, if I'm wrong, please correct me, non-Orthodox to observe.
Oh,
right?
yes, that's something.
And I'm sitting back and I'm saying, is this insanity? If we're having a family reunion, I'll call it that in very simple layman's terms, am I going to invite my neighbors and not invite my family to come and observe at least? It just doesn't make it. None of this makes any sense to me. And especially those who are the preachers of love, 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 love. But in their implementation of this meeting, council, whatever they want to call it, there's no observer status, I will call it, of the laity. I mean, to me, forgive me for being blunt, it's a joke. It's ridiculous.
Well, it is when you get down and you examine all the different aspects of this council, it's not only not a traditional council, it's a parody of an Orthodox council. When in the history of the church did the Orthodox invite condemned heretical representatives? That's what we're doing right now. We're inviting groups of heterodox whose faith, whose teaching has been condemned in council, not once, but 4 times. And I'm talking about the Monophysite groups. Historically, the faith that they're representing and they're coming, their teaching, that's the saints that they had have been anathematized by Orthodox councils, and we're inviting them to our council. That's never happened before. It's totally it doesn't make any sense from an Orthodox standpoint. It's an overturning of the Orthodox understanding of councils and their role in the church. So yes, I should have mentioned that. It's absolutely a terrible sign for this council that they've invited all these heterodox representatives for the first and last session, and yet have not invited so many Orthodox and bishops and monks and other representatives to be a part of it. It's just it's icing on the cake of what's wrong with this council and why it's going to be a problem.
Eblogite, Father.
Yes.
Just a question about the monasteries on Mount Athos. Has any monastery or all of Mount Athos as a body discussed, written a letter, made a statement about this? Any concerns, anything you can let us know about? Thank you.
Yeah, the several monasteries on Mount Athos came out. 6 of them came out actually publicly and released their letters to the Holy Community. The Holy Community is the governing body of Mount Athos. asking for the Holy Community, in other words, all 20 monasteries to gather and issue a text, and that happened. And all the 20 monasteries issued a text. And that text was sent to Patriarch Bartholomew, and it was asking for this similar things that the Church of Greece bishops like Metropolitan Rotos Vlachos have asked, and that is changes, so serious and important changes need to be made to the two texts that are the most controversial and problematic. So Mount Athos spoke with a unified voice and sought that the council's text be changed and amended and overturned and not accepted. I don't know how much the voice of all these bishops and priests are really being heard in Constantinople. My fear is, and I hope I'm wrong, that they're not being heeded, and that the positions of Constantinople, because they've proven themselves over decades now, that their positions are very solid and they're not going to change them. And that is that they recognize the heterodox, and especially the papal confession, as a church. So those texts from Athos and from Greece are very important for us to understand the faith. Whether they'll have any real practical application in terms of changing the minds of the Patriarchate of Constantinople or the Patriarchates in agreement with them, I am not very optimistic. But thanks be to God for the witness. Thanks be to God for the witness. Very important. Just continuing in this tradition of confessing the faith and standing against prayer with heretics and humanist conceptions of the church. So that's a very good example for us.
Father Peter, there's an expression saying that when a bishop bareheaded preaches heresy, right? First of all, clarify to us what that means, right? And for example, I've heard, and if I'm wrong, I want to be corrected, that the ecumenical patriarch is saying that we can't call this we cannot call this Great and Holy Synod an ecumenical synod because our brother, the Pope, and the others are not at the table with us. So do you want to comment on both things? First of all, what does it mean when we hear gymniti kephali, meaning bareheaded preaching heresy? And the second part here is saying, well, it's not an ecumenical synod because our brothers aren't here.
It's an expression. The first one is an expression, which means he's teaching officially as in a capacity of a bishop. And so it's a dogmatic issue. And so because when we're in this divine services, when the preaching happens, it's usually done without the kalamafki, without the mitre. So the bareheaded basically is a way to say that it's done as presenting the faith. It's not just like he's talking to somebody or something, but he's, as a bishop, he's preaching the faith and presenting officially. And so, yes, that definitely has happened repeatedly. The ecumenistic heresy, the ecclesiological error of ecumenism has been preached again and again and again from the ambon, but also from the television, which I think is just as much a pulpit as any ambon in any church. So that's the first thing, is that when a bishop is preaching boldly and unashamedly heretical teaching, that's what that's referring to. What was the second part of the question?
The second part, where, again, if I'm wrong, I want to be corrected, that my understanding is the ecumenical patriarchate is saying, well, listen, this is not an ecumenical synod because, the Pope isn't here.
Yes, not only has he said that, but that's been confirmed by others as well in the patriarchate. So yeah, that seems to be the position. The Archbishop of Crete has said the same thing in an interview. So this seems to be the position of the ecumenical patriarchate, that we cannot have an ecumenical council because the Pope is not there, which means that he considers the Pope to be a church, and that there's just some kind of schism that exists, but they're a church with mysteries and all the rest. That's exactly the heresy of ecumenism. Heresy of ecumenism is that we have a new definition and understanding of the church, and we're accepting heresy as the church. So it's a total innovation in terms of our faith in the church. He said that. He's been supported by that, and that is an amazing statement, very clearly expressing the delusion of ecumenism. and it's hard to hear because the implications are tremendous.
So the Father Peter, at what point in time will the Orthodox bishops, because from what I've understood, only a bishop can, in council, right, condemn another bishop. One might suggest, hey, listen, these other churches that don't want to come for very valid reasons can also say, we're going to come there and we're going to say, listen, I don't really, forgive me for being blunt, I don't really care what terms you're putting out, what you're setting up this council. We're going to come here, confess the faith, and we're actually going to say, you know what, and we're breaking off communion with you, not because of just the way you set up this council, but you're preaching bareheaded heresy, and that's it. Enough is enough. We're breaking off communion with you for dogmatic reasons, not for political or emotional or anything. Is that you are bareheaded preaching heresy, not once, twice. He's been patriarch now for, give or take 20 years, right? So enough is enough. When are the Orthodox bishops going to stand up and say, fait accompli, we're cutting off communion with you because you're not?
You'd have to ask the Orthodox bishops. I don't have an answer to why that has not happened at this point. There is a growing consensus that this is a heresy. There was a text that came out a year or two ago. It's called the New Ecclesiology of Patriarch Bartholomew, and they clearly call it a heresy, and it's signed by seven, maybe eight Orthodox bishops here in Greece. And those bishops clearly have understood the implications of his teaching, and the teaching, not just his teaching, there are actually many people, many others who teach the same in other local churches. So it's a pan-Orthodox problem, and really, if this council was really Orthodox, following the Holy Fathers, it would be called in order to condemn this heresy. That's what we need a council for. We need a council to condemn the heresy. Now, the most likely, if there is going to be any progress in this area, it'll be done locally in a local church. In other words, the Church of Georgia, for instance, could call a council and condemn, in particular, write a letter or a document and say, this is the teaching of the church, and this teaching is heresy. And I think that would be the next step in the whole process of overcoming the heretical teaching, is that a local church, a particular Orthodox church, take the first step and condemn it. Now, that would be a tremendous step in the right direction. And then we could, from that point on, we can move on to other local churches and then eventually an ecumenical council. So we're still far from that. But this whole council, we've seen a lot of opposition and a lot of good Orthodox statements coming out about the teaching of the church. And there are a lot of voices coming out that you didn't hear as much. And I think that by God's providence, he allowed this council and this fiasco, this parody of a council to come to be precisely in order for the Orthodox to unite more strongly and for their voices to be heard. So it might have to get worse before it gets better. And so this council might bring some very trying times to us, but it looks like it is an inevitable evil that is going to befall us before we essentially take the steps necessary to throw it off once and for all, if that's going to happen before the second coming. Only God knows. But that's where we're at right now. And so we have to stay vigilant, stay mindful, and understand our faith and help others and not become lax. And especially over the next couple of weeks, it'll be a very interesting time. I really expect many changes to come about in the church. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what I expect. I expect we're going to see some serious changes.
Father Peter, as you suggest, and if I'm not mistaken, again, correct me, that I can't give you exact dates, but the Russian Orthodox Church abroad years ago did condemn ecumenism as a heresy. From what I understand, they couldn't go on a further level because it wasn't at an ecumenical level, right? Meaning a truly ecumenical level. So if I understood you correctly earlier, what would be the difference between them, what they've already done, and it's very Orthodox and very sound, if the Patriarchate of Georgia or any other patriarchate in synod did the same thing? What would be the difference? What would be the implications?
Well, it was a fantastic text, and it's a good start. But the Church abroad was a kind of a unique situation at the time. It was still under, I think they were still under communism. I mean, it didn't have the effect that it could have today if a local church did it. The Church abroad is not exactly a local church. It's an autonomous church within the Russian Orthodox Church today, after the union. So, and at that time, it was in a particular situation then, which somewhat isolated itself from the other local Orthodox churches in a practical way, not so much in a Eucharistic way, but in a practical way they were more isolated, so they didn't have the effect it could have. But it was a fantastic Orthodox text, and the Russian Church Abroad also came out with a wonderful text just a few months ago on the council, in the same vein as Mount Athos and Metropolitan Orthodox. So there is, definitely potential for it to happen again, and more, and for other Orthodox churches to follow suit. What we're looking for in the local Orthodox Church, what they did.
Father, I just wanted to ask you two things that I read, if you can briefly comment on them. Okay, the first one you said, I think I read something you wrote a while ago, something about ceasing commemoration, but not ceasing communion, in that we remain in the church, but they don't, meaning those who depart from the faith. And the second thing was, when I was at Megathanasius a few weeks ago, the Brotherhood up the street, they said something about that a synod of bishops from the Church of Greece and the Church of Cyprus would attend outside of the ones that are not invited, would attend outside of this synod, and would conduct their own synod outside of the doors if they heard that the decisions that were made were uncanonical and undogmatic, and they would condemn those inside and the decisions inside. Do you know anything about that? Or
I haven't heard anything about that second part. The second thing you're talking about, it's news to me. I haven't heard anything, and I would be surprised if that happened. But the Church of Cyprus is a small church. There's not a lot of bishops, and their critique or their suggestions for the council were not impressive. So I would be surprised if there were a group of the Church of Cyprus or the Church of Greece who would take such a bold step. But I might be wrong, and may God bless them if they decide to make that. And I think that's really where it needs to go. If there's a synodical, conciliar acceptance of a humanistic mentality in terms of the church, well, the right response would be another council which would correct that. So that would be the proper ecclesiological next step. In terms of the first thing that you're talking about, yes, there is a difference between ceasing commemoration and breaking communion, and I think ceasing commemoration is definitely the patristic response, and it's happened before. It's happened on Mount Athos, and it's legitimate, and there's a canon that allows for it. It's very hard, however, once that begins. Many times in the recent church history, you see that there's a slippery slope. And so they begin by ceasing commemoration, but then slowly, because of the inevitable reaction on the part of the establishment or whatever, the people who are teaching the cacodoxy, there's going to be unforeseen circumstances and consequences, and the temptation is to start a parallel jurisdiction when they start defrocking those who have ceased commemoration and all the rest. So it's a delicate matter, and needs a lot of discernment, and the person who does it needs to have virtue and patience. And I would say that unless we arrive to the point where we are seeing clerics being defrocked and not creating those kind of jurisdictions or parallel jurisdictions, but are just simply being patient in their sufferings and in their unjust persecution, that's where the grace of God, personally, it's my opinion, will begin to work magnificently among the Orthodox. When the Orthodox see clergy, bishops, priests, monks who are being persecuted unjustly, it triggers within them the dynamic Orthodox response. And we haven't really seen that very much. There's been some cases, but not the kind of widespread reaction that I think is necessary. it's inevitable, and we need to not be afraid of it. We started this whole conversation by saying, or one of the things we said earlier, I should say, is about fundamentalism and suffering and all the rest. And that goes along with it. It's inevitable, and we have to pass through that, at least some of us do, in order for there to be redemptive suffering and for Christ to really dynamically react on our behalf. I think there's a spiritual law there at work that we need to respect. I'm going on and on, though. What's the next question?
Father, I wanted to ask a second question here. It seems to me almost like the way you describe this synod or council and the problems with it and the lack of following tradition of the church in terms of how it's being organized, that the fact that churches are even attending in itself is disheartening to somebody who is trying to struggle in this world to be an Orthodox Christian, and his or her people who are kind of running the church are kind of letting them down by even attending. Is that would you say that that might be a fair assessment, or it's misunderstood in that they're going there for good intentions rather than maybe for
I would say we shouldn't run to that conclusion. There are good bishops who are going to defend orthodoxy. In fact, when the Bulgarian church initially withdrew, I thought it was a mistake. I initially thought this is not a good reason, because I thought, well, there's going to be less of an Orthodox presence there to defend the faith. So I think there's definitely room for doubt and for, let's just leave it to God. There might be very good reasons for some to go and others not to go, and let's just not. There's no need to rush to conclusions and say everyone who goes is somehow departing from the faith. No, I don't think that's the case. I think it depends, and I think there will be good that there will be some Orthodox bishops there who are confessing the faith and who openly will stand against the innovative ecclesiology. It's necessary there too, but they have to be prepared to leave and not sign. Otherwise, it will be a terrible witness.
Evloyite, Father. So this is a follow-up, I guess, to that question. I guess you answered it in a little way, that we shouldn't just assume that everybody attending will be just blindly signing. So do we know of bishops that are attending that have been vocal about their their opposition to what is being presented and what will be discussed and how it's been organized, so on and so forth? Or have like select bishops been asked to attend who won't give much of a fight?
No, it's not, at least in the Church of Greece, it's not been that organized. No, there's not that kind of organization. It's been Metropolitan Heros Flakos is going to the council. He'll be speaking. And I think he could play a major role in the Church of Greece opposing the documents. So it remains to be seen what will happen. And as far as I know, but I've heard contradictory reports, Metropolitan Athanasius of Lemesu is also going, but I might be wrong. I don't know. So there are definitely Orthodox confessing bishops in terms of this heresy of ecumenism who will be present, and I think they'll give a good witness. So, I can see both sides. I can see both sides. I can see reasons for being there, reasons for not being there. After days passed and I started to think more deeply about what the Church of Bulgaria did and the Church of Georgia, I do think there's legitimacy in their not going. If they're going, if that's for the right reasons, right? Because the Church of Antioch apparently is not attending for other reasons. Church of Russia seems to be not attending because there are not all the Orthodox churches present, and not so much for matters of dogma or doctrine or heresy. Whereas it seems like the Church of Georgia especially, and the Church of Bulgaria especially, those two, their reasoning is sound, and they're saying that this council, the way it's organized, the way it's being carried out, the way that it's not traditionally anything like previous councils, the way that the texts themselves, at least one text, is totally unacceptable. On that basis, we're not attending, and I think it's legitimate. I think it's legitimate. You know, when you see a temptation coming, you see a trap being set, it's not heroism to go and put your foot in it. So there is on both sides of the decisions, I can see the reasoning and accept it.
Well, Father Peter, we've exhausted you and the questions, I think. And again, thank you for this very last minute, very meaningful talk and discussion. And I hope that you know, the spirit of Pentecost, the true spirit of Pentecost, you know, the Holy Spirit will lead those of good disposition to a good confession of the faith, for the unity of the faith. And as we say, one of the hymns of the church, that we put to arrest any of the schisms and the scandals in the church, and for God's glory, and that the truth above all will prevail.
I mean, let's hope that the spirit of Pentecost is truly present, at least among those confessing bishops, and that a good witness is given.
I mean, we can ask for your closing prayers. Thank you.
Well, I don't really have a closing prayer, except that we can chant Soson Kyrie. If you want to start out over there, Nico.
Soson Kyrie ton laon su kevelogison tin kliron amian su ni kastis vasilevsi kata varvaron dorumenos και τον σον φυλάτων δια του σταυρού σου πολιτεύμα.
Διεφόντων αγιοβετέρημον, Κύριε σου Χριστέ, ο Θεός ελέης και σώσον ημάς. Αμήν.
Αμήν.
Καληνύχτα, ευχαριστούμε.
Thank you, Papa.